Hey, warm-up from Elo! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined in a few minutes by one of our good friends, Tristan Freeman, who does such an amazing job over at Bussin' Brackets. We're going to be chatting with him about what we've all seen the last week or so in the Atlantic 10 and how to be able to gauge St. Joe's with regards to this very interesting landscape out there in the Atlantic 10. Are they going to be a team that's able to maintain, surprise? What are his thoughts? We're going to be chatting about that. And if Steve Donahue might be a little bit of an upgrade for this upcoming season over Billy Lange as well. We're also going to be talking about the rest of the Atlantic 10 landscape, why the bottom teams like LaSalle, Fordham, who made coaching changes, they might be looking a little bit bullish. What can we expect out of St. Louis, Dayton? What are going to be the expectations with them, with having perhaps smaller name guys than they had a season ago, but perhaps a little bit more chemistry? And we're going to dive in on so much of this great conference, so we're going to have a lot of fun there. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @GUnit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter. So, as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. While I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. EdgeBoost is making sure that bettors are able to have access to their funds whenever and wherever. With EdgeBoost, 100% of gambling transactions always do get approved. And when you go to edgeboost.bet, utilize our promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That's going to get you a $1-for-$1 match on your first deposit up to $25. And if you like the Atlantic 10, well, within the next 48 hours after this podcast, you are going to get my Atlantic 10 conference preview as well, because we've got that as the lone conference I need to do before we do our Power 5 conference previews, because I always do a conference preview podcast for every single one of these conferences. So we've got a lot of fun there. So that is going to be coming your way. We'll have Kevin Sweeney aboard for that. He's another one of our good friends, as Tristan. He's doing great work over at Bussin' Brackets. He's doing great work over with Sleepers Media, Field of 68. He's a 520 player. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at OopsNut351. And Tristan, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Greg. Appreciate it as always.
I appreciate you, Tristan. And Tristan, it's been now about a week ever since St. Joe's lost their coach in Billy Lange. It is going to be indeed the case where they're going to be looking to a veteran of the game to be able to take over in Steve Donahue. And how do you take a look at the St. Joe's team for right now? Because as far as I've seen, we really haven't seen like an exodus in terms of players entering into the transfer portal. Now guys have 30 days after the move was made, so they still have about 3 or so weeks to be able to do so if they really do want to jump into the transfer portal. But I would think that at this juncture it would be very difficult for these guys to enter. So it feels like we sort of have what we have now with St. Joe's a week after the fact.
Yeah, and you look at some of their more notable off-season transfers. You know, Deuce Jones was an all-8-10 freshman at LaSalle. You still bring back Justice Aljabor, who was a really good big man for them. And then, you know, guys like Derek Simpson and, you know, Jayton Glover were guys that could have easily gotten interest had they entered the portal. But it's probably just too late at this point. You know, many teams don't really have any NIL funds to give out, so you don't really want to leave on a discount. And ultimately, you know, all these guys who aren't seniors, you know, they're 1-year rentals potentially. So if things don't work out with the new head coach situation, they can very easily just leave and go elsewhere.
Yep, absolutely. I do think that it's a little bit difficult in the juncture, and I do take a look at the St. Joe's team, and they do bring back quite a bit from a season ago. They still have relatively good chemistry. I know that Steve Donahue wasn't on the coaching staff last year, but this is a guy that has a lot of familiarity with the Philadelphia area, and I think that it's going to be an interesting team because with Billy Lange, he was such a good recruiter, but not so good with the X's and O's, and I feel like Donahue might honestly be the opposite because he hasn't done a lot of recruiting for teams with NIL as he was in the Ivy League for the longest of times, but I mean, we saw in his time at Cornell that he's able to get a team to the Sweet 16, and he's able to drop X's and O's quite well.
And look, he was able to, like you said, he had Cornell very competitive during a time where, you know, teams like Harvard and Yale would always dominate at the top. And he does have power conference experience, you know, back at Boston College where he had a winning year. So it's not the worst situation for interim, you know, although now he's officially the full-time head coach, you know, situation for St. Joe's where, you know, they could have really been, you know, out of luck. But yeah, I think Donahue's going to is a solid coach for him. If nothing else, he gives them stability for at least the next year or so where if things don't, work out and he's not, the long-term option, they can now, go through a full head coach and hire process, something that, some fans could argue they probably should have done before.
Absolutely. As Tristan Freeman, who does such great work over at Bustin' Brackets. I know he's doing some great work over at Sleepers Media as well. He is joining me right here on Coast to Coast Soups, and I think that it is interesting to take a look at St. Joe's in terms of hierarchy of the Atlantic 10 because it just feels like there's going to be a big giant middle once again. A lot of people have VCU as either the number one or number two team of the conference, which it's hard to really debate, but how big is the difference between a team like a VCU versus, say, a George Washington, say, a Dayton, insert your favorite number three, number four, A10 team here. And I do feel like, once again, this could be a team that's in the middle. And if you're in the middle in the Atlantic 10, one or two bounces that go your way could be the difference in like 3 or 4 spots in the standings when it's all said and done with how competitive this conference is.
Yeah, the goal for St. Joe's is just to avoid the bottom where they can get at least a first round bye in the A10 tournament. For seed favorites, Dayton and BC are still going to be fairly young. Teams like St. Joe's, Loyola Chicago, and GW, who are led by big men, have new guards, and it'll take time for them to get things going. Then you have the perennial bottom teams, LaSalle and Fordham, who doesn't have the kind of talent that St. Joe's have. So I do think that there's potential for the Hawks to be in the middle tier. That was where they were, before the fire. And so some may argue that they had an upgraded coaching, but it will come down to, whether or not Deuce Jones can be a sophomore breakout all-league guy and whether or not Jayden Glover can be the former top 50 prospect that he was before and be a potential star. It's not hopeless for the Hawks. Let's just say that.
Yep, absolutely. When you've got a guy like Ajabor down low, who's a relatively rock-solid shot blocker, who actually began his career out there in the Ivy League. Speaking of the Ivy League, that helps you out. Obviously, lose quite a bit of that backcourt and Rasheer Fleming from seasons ago. That does hurt, but still a lot of returning pieces in Derek Simpson and company. And I do just take a look at this Atlantic 10, and I think that's going to be a very fascinating year because you know this as well as I do covering the conference. It's a melting pot of a lot of different styles. You always have a team that's built on defense, playing relatively slow in St. Bonaventure. Hopefully for St. Louis's sake, they're able to stay healthy unlike a season ago. And I take a look at a lot of those middle teams once again. What we're going to be able to get out of a team like a St. Louis, what we're going to get out of a team like a George Mason. And I do think that that's going to shape the conference because this has been a conference that has always been really, really competitive, but has had a hard time getting more than 1 or 2 teams into the NCAA tournament because those middle teams seem to always knock off the top teams, and it causes for a lot of carnage up there in the standings.
Yeah, with so much talent gone throughout college basketball, with the COVID year guys away, I think it's a chance for the power conference not to be as dominant, which alone should give opportunities. And I do think that the bottom of the A10 should be better where you don't have, teams in the 200, but they are still going to be half the league to be top 100 teams so that you have situations where you can get, build quad 1, quad 2 wins. And then more importantly, you just can't have bad losses in the non-con. That's been an issue for some of the teams in the A10 where they look bad in the non-con, but then they get it together during league play. But by then, their numbers sort of drop. And Duquesne was an example of that where they had several bye-game losses, but then ended up being a 500 team in league play and getting a couple of wins, including the George Mason one that pretty much knocked them out of the at-large conversation.
Yep, and there are some of those teams out there that will do that to you in this conference, but I also do feel like with UMass leaving in the offseason and just in my opinion, a lot of the bottom teams getting a little bit better, I think that helps out as well because like Fordham and LaSalle, I don't have massive expectations for them, but I really like the coaching changes that those 2 teams made. I think that is going to make the bottom a little bit better, and while those losses still would be bad for a team like a VCU if they lose to LaSalle, I don't think that would be as detrimental this year as it might have been, say, a year or 2 ago.
Yeah, and not just them, but, Davidson and Richmond have teams that sort of, fallen a bit from the pack. They've usually been sort of top half teams in the league, so you want to get them going as well. Same with Duquesne, with Drew Joyce entering year 2. I do think with the rosters retooling that there is opportunities for sort of new stars to develop. But again, and also, some of these teams don't really have the toughest non-con schedule. So even if LaSalle and Fordham aren't very good, you still want them to have good non-con campaigns. So if nothing else, they're not going to be an anchor metrics-wise once league play. So.
Yep, absolutely. That is such a big key because we see that in a few conferences. I know that you do a great job covering the ACC as well, and it feels like that's really been the detriment to them, where you have those bottom teams and they just absolutely drag them down. As Tristan Freeman, who does such great work over at Boston Brackets, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I do want to chat with Tristan on the flip side about a few teams of intrigue that are not being picked by a lot of people as the number one teams, but I think are going to be rock solid. Dayton is one of those teams because they don't have as much name, shall we say, brand guys coming in, but I feel like they did a good job in the offseason. St. Louis, what can we expect with year number 2 of Robbie Avila along with Josh Ertz over at Indiana State? I also want to ask him just about a few teams in general that in his research outside the Atlantic 10, he's starting to feel a little bit bullish on. That's up next right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Beast and Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast. Always a pleasure to be joined by Tristan Freeman. He's doing an incredible job over at Boston Brackets, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball, based out there in the Pittsburgh area. So he does a great job covering the Panthers, Duquesne, and so much more. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter /X at Oops351. And Tristan, how about if we dive in on this team, as they don't necessarily have as much, shall we say, firepower with regards to the name brand guys coming in, but I still feel like they're rock solid. It's Dayton. And I feel like the big reason why is that Dayton brought in a lot of splash last offseason, bringing in Posh Alexander, Zed Key, former starters at power conferences. They just didn't quite work out for Dayton. And I feel like Dayton, even though they brought in guys that don't necessarily have as much spark with regards to their actual name, I just feel like they fit the system a little bit better. Like a Jordan Durcock, who comes on over from Rutgers, I think is going to fit the style. Keontae Jones is a versatile do-it-all sort of player, and I want to get your thoughts on the Dayton team because typically they're picked either number 1 or number 2 in the conference. I'm seeing there are some people that have them a little bit below that, still not outside like the top 5 or anything like that, but I do feel like this could be a Dayton team that actually lives up to / exceeds expectations unlike a season ago, even though the names aren't quite as big, just because I do feel like the buy-in with these guys might be a little bit better.
They have a potential lead guard return in Javon Bennett, who I think had like 30 points in the NIT tournament. So he's ready to be a lead guy. Adam Nenjai is a transfer coming over from Iona, who's a double-digit scorer, and he's a capable shooter as well. And then you mentioned Keontae Jones, who was a one-time former Alabama commit. There were reported off-season issues going on that made his portal journey ultimately be one of the longest, but he gives Dayton a true 4-man, something that they didn't really have on the roster to begin with. And then, Mel Latong was a really good freshman big man for them last year. He's going to be an easy breakout candidate. So if he, takes that leap, and you already have Bennett and the transfers work out, then they absolutely have a pathway to being the team to beat the A-10.
Yep, and with this Dayton team, I do feel like they just have such a good coaching staff with Anthony Grant and company, always doing a rock-solid job out there. And with the Atlantic 10, I do think that there's going to be a lot of intrigue with this conference. And one team that I just continue to take a look at and I think is so fascinating is this George Mason team, because I feel like Tony Skinn, a guy that was obviously a part of that George Mason Final Four team, if you go back, almost got his team ousted from the NCAA tournament before it started with the way that he got suspended for the first game of the NCAA tournament. But I look at them as being such an interesting team as well, bringing in a guy, Masai Troutman, who had some relatively good years over at Northeastern, but just dealt with a few injuries last year. Dola Adebayo, who comes over from the Metro Atlantic, Nick Ellington, and for George Mason, I think we both know this is not going to be a team that's going to be super explosive on offense, but I take a look at the way that they're able to rebound. They're just taking on that Tony Skinn toughness, and I think that once again, this is going to be a team that nobody is going to want to play. I think that they're going to sneak up on a lot of the top teams in the conference.
They lost so many seniors last season, and they also lost their best player, Jalen Haynes, to the portal. So, like you said, so many new faces. It'll be interesting to see how it works out because they were an elite defense last year with great front court depth. And with guard play that was very good, led by Darius Maddox. It'll be interesting to see which of these guys break out. They're going to need Troutman or Corey Mincy to break out in the backcourt. It'll come down to whether or not they have, all league talent, or if, Tony Skinn just hit on all the transfers. So there's obviously potential because they were the surprise team in the A10 last year, but you do kind of want to wait to see what they look like on paper before having them back in the top tier status.
And I do think that that's well stated by you. And I do want to take a look at this bunch as well because they just dealt with so many injuries last year. And I just don't feel like we got to see the true version of them. And that'd be St. Louis because, I mean, last offseason, all the hype was around Robbie Avila being one of the most just polarizing and one of the most fun players in all of college basketball. We're just not hearing as much of that because St. Louis had a little bit of a lost season last year, but I feel like these guys are breakout candidates as well. I think that they did a nice job of being able to supplement that backcourt, bringing in a guy like a Deion Brown from Boston College. I feel like was a smooth get, one that went a little bit under the radar. Paul Otinho, who comes on over from Quinnipiac, is a guy that I really like. And for St. Louis, they had a really good starting five last year, but no depth. And I feel like this offseason, they did a really good job of being able to address that depth. And now if there is an injury or two, they're a little bit more equipped to be able to handle it.
Yeah, their offense is really potent when you add Isaiah Swope and all-time leading scorer for the program, the sharpshooter Gibson Jimerson, but they just weren't really a good defensive team. And yeah, you can blame that on the lack of depth, but they weren't really built to be that good on defensive end. But you bring in Deion Brown from Boston College, who's an elite player at UMBC, Trey Green, who's another high power conference transfer. And look out for Mario McCautry because he was one of the newcomers that had some really good games as a freshman. He's going to be a sophomore breakout to watch as well. They're going to be a top four caliber team. They're going to have probably the best offense in the league again. But it is ultimately going to come down to whether or not they're going to be a good enough defensive team to win the regular season title. Otherwise, they're going to be vulnerable to losing games that they may not necessarily was supposed to.
Yep, absolutely. With St. Louis, that's a little bit of an issue for them. And heck, we even saw that over at Indiana State when Josh Schertz was coaching them up as Tristan Freeman, who does such an amazing job over at Bustin' Brackets. He's joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And Tristan, you do an amazing job of covering the Atlantic 10, but you really do a great job on so many fronts. Take a look at this amazing game of college basketball. I know that you're getting set with a lot of your conference previews. I know that you're getting set just taking a look at a wide variety of things. And have there just been a few teams that have been standing out over the last few weeks that you're taking a look at and you're feeling bullish with? As I know that you also did a little bit of work with Seth Davis and his new website. I believe that would be HQ Sports and HQ Hoops. So you're doing a great job there. But are there a few teams that are just coming onto your radar that maybe they weren't there a few months ago that you're starting to feel good about?
I just worked on an ACC preseason power ranking, and I'm surprised how high I had Syracuse because there's just so much talent that they have that it almost feels like they're going to be too big to fail as it did last year. You know, J.J. Starlin, the leading scorer, is back, and you get to move him off ball by having him with Nathan George, who is the top passer in the ACC at Georgia Tech. And obviously, Kyle Anthony is son of, NBA Hall of Famer Carmelo Anthony. He's come in as well. And then Donnie Freeman was a really good forward for them as a freshman. He's going to be back. There's just, because of how much talent, the rest of the ACC lost, I do think it's a really good opportunity for the Orange to make a leap. And if they don't with this group, then it's going to be hard to envision Red Autry keeping his job for another year.
Yeah, with Red Autry, it is going to be a big year number 3 for him. We've got a lot of coaches that have big year number 3s. I just did my American Conference preview. They've got a lot of them out there, so it's going to be a lot of put up or shut up years for a lot of these coaches. There's going to be a lot of intrigue in the ACC. There's going to be a lot with regards to the Atlantic 10. I know that Tristan, you did a podcast a few days ago talking about the Horizon League as well, so you're all over the place. You're getting set for what is going to be an amazing college basketball season. You're on a wide variety of different platforms, posting up articles and so much more. So love to get people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Absolutely. You can follow me at hoopsnut351 on Twitter/X, and also follow my main site at Bustin' Brackets. And we're full ahead in the preseason mode, working on season and conference previews as we speak, and just excited at the season's soon here.
Absolutely. The season is creeping up on us, about a month and a half away. Cannot come soon enough, and I know that our guy Tristan, he is doing such an incredible job taking a look at this great game of college basketball. So big thanks to Tristan for joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Larsium, maybe does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. Then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I'm with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. And I know I've been talking a lot about the Atlantic 10 the last few days with the St. Joe's coaching change. We're going to get a little bit more of it, as within the next 48 hours, I'll have my Atlantic 10 conference preview up. And then from there, we've got the Power 5 conferences remaining. So we're getting through those conference previews, and we're giving you guys a fresh podcast every single day. And I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.